The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's cardiac unit hummed their mechanical song at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and Elena Martinez moved through them like a ghost who'd learned to push a medication cart. 3 years. That's how long she'd been invisible here, and invisibility was the only armor she needed anymore. Her scrubs were navy blue, the color of the navy she'd left behind, the color of a life where people knew her name and what that name meant. Now her ID badge read simply E. Martinez, RN, with a photo that showed none of the scars beneath the fabric, not the one across her left ribs from Sanjan Valley, not the one webbing her right shoulder blade from the IED at Lashkar Gah, not the one that lived in her chest and tightened every time a door slammed without warning. Her locker was at the end of the corridor, tucked between the break room and the supply closet. Inside hung 2 sets of spare scrubs, a half-eaten protein bar she'd forgotten about 3 weeks ago, and on the bottom shelf, a pair of combat boots. Desert tan, creased from 1,000 patrol routes through Marjah, still holding the dust of Helmand Province in their tread like a memory she couldn't wash clean. The boots had carried her 4 miles through Taliban crossfire while she dragged Captain James Rourke through the rubble of a forward operating base. The boots had walked her out of the Navy when the PTSD got so loud that her own breathing sounded like incoming fire. The boots were the only thing that proved any of it had been real. Elena checked her watch, 23:44. She had 13 minutes before shift change, before the day nurses handed over their patients and she inherited the night. She preferred nights. Nights meant fewer visitors, fewer families asking questions, fewer reasons to make eye contact. Nights meant she could do her work and disappear back into the anonymity that had become her religion. She pulled her hair back into a bun so tight it gave her a headache, but the pressure was something she could control, something that felt like discipline instead of panic. The cardiac unit on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart held 14 beds, and on a Tuesday night in November, 12 of them were occupied. Elena moved through her pre-shift rounds with the precision of someone who'd learned long ago that attention to detail was the difference between life and death. Room 301, 78-year-old post-op cab, vital stable, telemetry showing normal sinus rhythm. Room 302, 62-year-old with unstable angina, EKG strips taped to the chart like confessions. Room 303, 41-year-old awaiting cardiac catheterization, already anxious, already requesting pain medication. She checked the medication dispensary logs against the supply orders, her hands moving through the work with the muscle memory of someone who'd been trained by the military to verify every single component before it went into a patient, before it went into a body, before it went where mistakes became funerals. That's when she noticed the discrepancy. The supply order from last month listed 17 for pumps requisitioned, but the inventory log showed only 9 had actually been used on the unit. 4 more had been stocked for the post-operative wing. That left for unaccounted for. Elena's jaw tightened. She'd been doing this long enough to know that equipment didn't vanish. Equipment got billed, whether it was used or not. Equipment became money that moved in directions nobody was supposed to ask about. She made a note in her personal log, something she'd started doing quietly, methodically, one discrepancy at a time, and moved toward room 304. The new admission had come in at 19:30, transferred from the ER with cardiac arrhythmia and a history that made Elena's breath catch despite every training manual she'd internalized about maintaining professional composure. Green Beret. Age 46. Traumatic brain injury sustained 14 months ago during a combat operation. The name on the admission paperwork was Captain James Rourke, and the moment she read it, her hands went still. She knew that name the way a person knows the scar on their own body, from the inside, from memory, from the weight of it. Captain Rourke was the reason she'd earned the call sign a Valkyrie in Marjah. He was the reason her combat boots were still caked with Afghan dust. He was the reason she'd almost died pulling him for miles through fire and rubble and the kind of heat that makes air visible. She'd had his name inked onto her forearm in memorial the same way every warrior in her unit had memorialized the ones they'd carried. Every single one. But when Elena stepped into room 304, Captain Rourke looked at her the way a person looks at a stranger in an elevator, with polite confusion and the distance of someone whose memory had been erased by trauma. His eyes were the same dark brown she remembered, but the recognition she'd expected wasn't there. There was only the blank, gentle courtesy of a man who'd survived his body but lost the contents of his mind. The traumatic brain injury had stolen him from himself in a way that made Elena understand, for the first time in 3 years, that forgetting could be a mercy. "Hi there," Captain Rourke said, his voice the same gravel and smoke voice she remembered from the Phi base, now softened by something pharmaceutical and permanent. "Are you my night nurse?" Elena took a breath that felt like it came from underwater. She checked his full line. She verified his telemetry connection. She noted his vital signs: blood pressure 138/82, heart rate 71, O2 saturation 97% on room air. Normal. Stable. The body remembered its own rhythms even when the mind forgot everything else. "I am," she said, and her voice was exactly what it always was at night, quiet, deferential, the voice of someone who'd learned that invisibility was survival. "How are you feeling this evening, Captain?" "A little woozy," he said, managing a smile that broke something in her chest she'd spent 3 years protecting. "They tell me my heart's being finicky. Have we met before? You look like someone I should remember." Elena's hands didn't tremble. Hands that had held tourniquets tight around bleeding limbs didn't tremble at small moments of disappointment. She checked his peripheral lines, the steadiness of her fingers a masterclass in control, a lesson learned from officers who'd taught her that emotion was a luxury only amateurs could afford. "First time meeting you, Captain. I'm just your nurse tonight." She was already turning to leave when she heard the sound, the cardiac unit door slamming hard enough to vibrate the windows. Not a slam from carelessness, but from weight and force, the kind of impact that echoed down the hallway like a percussion instrument designed to trigger every alarm system in a body that had learned to associate loud noise with shrapnel and death. Elena's shoulders seized. Her breath cut short. For exactly 0.2 of a second, she wasn't in Sacred Heart anymore. She was in Marjah. She was checking the perimeter. She was listening for the whistle that came before the boom. Then the moment passed, and she was back, and Captain Rourke was watching her with concern, and her professionalism closed around her like armor. She steadied herself against the bed rail. "Excuse me," she said, her voice still even, still controlled. "I'll be right back with your evening medications." She made it to the supply closet before the tremor reached her hands. Not from fear. From restraint. The tremor was what it felt like to swallow a scream. The tremor was what it took to stay invisible when everything inside you wanted to fight back against a world that kept finding new ways to prove you weren't safe. Dr. Sterling was waiting at the nurse's station when Elena emerged 10 minutes later with Captain Rourke's medications prepared and double-checked. The cardiac unit director stood with his tablet propped against his chest like a shield, his eyes moving between the screen and Elena's medication chart with the intensity of someone hunting for something specific. He was 62, with the kind of expensive haircut that suggested he'd never had to count his money. His white coat was pressed with geometric precision, and his stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal of rank he'd earned purely through survival in the system, not through any particular gift for healing. "Miss Martinez," he said, and the formality of her surname coming from his mouth felt like a warning. "I noticed something unusual in your charting. Your supply orders for last month, you've documented 17 for pump requisitions. That seems high." Elena kept her attention on the medication list in her hands. "Our census was up," she said, the words coming out soft, deferential, the words of someone who'd learned that questioning authority in nursing meant arguing with someone who controlled your schedule and your schedule controlled your survival. "Lot of post-operative patients. Lot of demand." "Interesting," Dr. Sterling said, and something in his tone made her look up. His eyes were the color of a shallow pond in summer, murky and cold and revealing nothing underneath. "Because according to the post-operative wing's own requisition log, they only took 3 of those pumps. And we rarely stock more than 9 for the cardiac unit itself. So 4 pumps seem to have disappeared." Elena's hands were perfectly steady now. Steady in the way they'd been steady during every trauma code she'd ever run, every crisis where her body had learned that panic was a luxury. "I just chart what gets ordered and delivered," she said. "I don't make the requisition decisions." Dr. Sterling smiled, and it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. It was the smile of someone who'd just decided something about a person, and the decision wasn't going to be in her favor. "Of course," he said. "Just making sure our records are accurate. Can't be too careful with hospital inventory. Liability issues." He walked away, his footsteps clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who owned the space he moved through. Elena watched him go, and somewhere in her chest, something that had been quiet for 3 years started to hum. The same frequency as danger. The same pitch as the whistle before the boom. She had no idea that she'd just been identified as a threat. She had no idea that Dr. Sterling's lake house payments depended on phantom equipment charges that her meticulous charting was about to expose. She had no idea that the quiet competence she'd brought to this job, the same competence that had kept her alive in Marjah, had just painted her as the enemy of a man with institutional power and everything to lose. What she didn't know was that Captain Rourke was sleeping now in room 304, his name still tattooed on her forearm beneath her long-sleeved scrubs, and the recognition he couldn't give her was something she'd learned to live without. What she knew was that her boots were still in her locker, still holding the dust of a life she'd survived, still waiting for the moment when survival wasn't enough anymore. But that wasn't the worst part. The 2 p.m. cafeteria at Sacred Heart was a collision of scrubs and schedules, 100 voices layering over the industrial hiss of the serving lines. Elena stood at the salad bar, assembling lunch with the same methodical precision she'd brought to every shift for 3 years: romaine, cucumber, precisely measured olive oil. She wasn't watching Dr. Sterling. She didn't need to. She could feel him across the room the way you feel pressure changes before a storm. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I'll bet $50 our little night owl Martinez quits within a week." He stood near the register, holding court with 3 board members and a surgical resident, his voice calibrated just loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear. These quiet types always break. Can't handle the pressure of a real unit. The salad bar went still. Not silent, people kept moving, kept serving themselves, but the conversations around Elena narrowed to whispers, and she felt the weight of 40 eyes shifting toward her in that particular way of hospital staff recognizing a public execution in slow motion. One of the board members laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the tile. The surgical resident looked at his shoes. Elena's hand stopped on the edge of her tray. One measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in forward surgical teams when the compound mortars came in at 0300 and panic wasn't an option. Her vision narrowed to the salad before her, the edges of her peripheral sight sharp and clear. A single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from fear, not from shame, but from the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by a man who'd never survived anything worse than a golf handicap. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact with Sterling across the room and said, in a voice like still water, "I've survived worse odds, Doctor." The statement landed with a weight that seemed to surprise him. His jaw tightened. He smiled anyway, that thin smile of a predator who'd just realized his prey had teeth, and turned back to his audience, already recalibrating, already planning. Elena picked up her tray and moved to the far corner table, her hand steady as concrete, her shoulders set like a fighter settling into stance. But that wasn't the worst part. The next afternoon, during her meal break, Elena sat alone at one of the plastic tables in the staff dining area, her lunch spread before her, pasta primavera, a bottle of cranberry juice, silverware arranged with military precision. She'd learned long ago that eating alone was safer than the politics of shared tables. She was halfway through the first bite when Dr. Sterling appeared with his own tray, his presence announcing itself before his words did. "Elena." He sat across from her without invitation, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like everything about him. "I've been meaning to ask you about your experience with cardiac protocols. Some of the night shift nurses mentioned they weren't certain about your background." She set down her fork slowly. Carefully. The kind of careful that comes from muscle memory, from a time when sudden movements meant incoming fire. "I'm ACLS certified," she said. "BLS. I've completed the cardiac unit orientation twice." "That's not what I asked." He leaned forward, his elbow resting on the edge of the table with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I asked about your actual experience." Elena opened her mouth to answer. She was, in fact, about to say something professional and measured when Sterling's elbow jerked sharply backward, a movement that might have been accidental, might have been a sudden thought, might have been calculated with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks planning exactly this moment. Her entire tray went flying. The pasta scattered across the tile in an arc like shrapnel. The juice bottle shattered against the edge of the table, cranberry liquid spreading across the floor like a wound. Silverware clattered with the sound of spent brass casings. The room didn't go silent, the room had been waiting for this, and now it exhaled into a held breath, 50 staff members suddenly very interested in their own meals, their own conversations, their own survival. Sterling looked at the mess, then at Elena, his smile widening into something that wasn't quite smiling anymore. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched for the audience now, not for her, "you should be more careful." Elena knelt. Slowly. Her knees bent with the deliberate control of someone who'd kneeled in 100 situations worse than this, in dust, in blood, in conditions that would make this carpeted floor look like a 4-star hotel. She began collecting the scattered pasta, piece by piece, her hands moving with the same precision they'd used to save lives. Her movements were so controlled, so methodical, that for a moment Sterling seemed almost disappointed, as if he'd expected her to break, and her refusal to break was somehow worse for him than if she had. A second tear escaped. Just one. Just one, because that's all she allowed herself, and it tracked down her cheek as she moved from piece to piece, her voice, when it came, barely above a whisper. "I've been called worse by better men." The statement hung in the air like something radioactive. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a defense. It was a flat statement of fact delivered by someone whose eyes had seen things Sterling would spend his entire life trying to imagine. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or fear, before he covered it with another smile and stood, brushing his hands on his slacks as if her presence had left them dirty. Elena finished collecting every piece. A nurse from the ICU brought paper towels without being asked. Nobody else moved. Nobody else spoke. She cleaned the floor in silence while Sterling returned to his usual table and his usual crowd, but his voice was different now, quieter, less certain, the way voices get when a hunter realizes he's been hunting something apex. That evening, as Elena was making her rounds on the cardiac unit, checking vitals and reviewing charts, she passed room 304. Captain James Rourke was standing in the doorway, his four-pole beside him like a metal companion, his eyes tracking her with the confusion of someone watching a memory that wouldn't quite surface. His forearm was visible, the tattoo visible, Martinez inked in block letters along the inside of his wrist, done in fading ink that spoke of desert dust and forward surgical teams and a night when the only thing between him and the hereafter was a woman whose name was worth burning into skin. He didn't know that anymore. The traumatic brain injury had stolen that knowledge clean away, left only the tattoo and the feeling that he should remember something important, something that mattered more than breathing. He looked at her the way you look at a stranger who seems familiar, and when Elena met his eyes, she saw the effort it cost him, the neural pathways firing and misfiring, trying to bridge a gap that the blast had torn too wide. "You're the nurse," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elena said quietly. "I know you, don't I?" "In another life," she said, and turned to continue her rounds before he could see the crack forming in her composure. That crack widened over the next 72 hours as Dr. Sterling's plan shifted from public humiliation to something more calculated, more institutional, more dangerous. The morning after the cafeteria incident, Elena received a call from hospital administration requesting her presence at a meeting regarding her credentials. She walked into the office with her hand steady and her heart running at a pace that would have alarmed any monitor, and sat across from 3 people whose expressions had already made their decision before she'd sat down. "We've been reviewing your employment history," the compliance officer began, a thin woman whose tone suggested she'd already drafted the termination letter. "It shows some significant gaps. Extended periods of time with no listed employment." Elena had prepared for this conversation, had rehearsed it in the small hours when sleep wouldn't come. "I took a career break," she said. Personal reasons. I returned to nursing when I was ready. The board has expressed some concerns about your qualifications for our cardiac unit, the woman continued, ignoring the explanation. We'd like to know more about your previous nursing experience. What Elena knew was that this meeting was a performance, that the decision had already been made by someone in a golf cart or a private office, that nothing she said would change the trajectory now set in motion. What Elena also knew was that she'd survived 3 tours in Marjah, had carried men twice her size across open ground while rounds snapped the air around her head, had held her composure while watching people die who shouldn't have had to die. She could survive this too. She answered their questions with precision and professional courtesy, never mentioning the forward surgical teams, never explaining the gaps, never offering anything they could weaponize beyond what they already had. When the meeting ended, because these meetings always end when the predetermined conclusion has been reached, she walked back to her unit with her shoulders level and her eyes dry. But in his office, Dr. Sterling was already making calls. The $47,000 discrepancy sat in Elena's hands like a live round. For supply invoices for cardiac monitoring systems, top-of-the-line Philips monitors, each one priced at $11,750. The numbers didn't lie. The inventory log didn't lie. What lied was the equipment list itself. None of those monitors existed on the unit. None. She'd been auditing supply chains for the cardiac unit during her 4th night shift, cross-referencing purchase orders against physical inventory, a habit from her Navy days when accountability meant lives. The charts didn't balance. They never balanced. But this wasn't a missing box of latex gloves or a miscounted for drip, this was institutional fraud, the kind that rippled through insurance reimbursements and federal billing codes, the kind that would trigger audits Elena didn't want to contemplate. At 5:51 a.m., with a unit quiet except for the rhythmic breathing of ventilators and the soft beep of cardiac monitors, Elena walked to Dr. Sterling's office. The hallway fluorescent lights hummed their institutional song, casting everything in shades of clinical white. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She'd learned to move like that in the field: precision, silence, efficiency. She knocked once. Dr. Sterling looked up from his desk, his face pleasant at first, then calculating as he registered the supply printouts in her hands. His office smelled of expensive cologne and the bitter tang of black coffee. The walls held his credentials: Harvard Medical School, fellowship at Johns Hopkins, photographs with hospital board members and state legislators. A man who'd built his identity on accumulated prestige and the certainty that nurses asked no questions. These equipment charges, Elena said. Her voice was steady, flat as water. $47,000 across for invoices. Philips monitors ordered in February, March, twice in April. But they're not on the floor. They're not in storage. They're not anywhere. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, he said nothing. Then he stood, moving around the desk with the casual grace of a man accustomed to dominance. "You've been auditing my supply requisitions," he said. "Not a question. I audit all supply requisitions. That's part of inventory management. You're a nurse, Ms. Martinez. Not a procurement officer. Not a financial analyst." His smile appeared, thin as a knife blade. "Certainly not an accountant." "The numbers don't match," Elena said. "I thought you'd want to know." He stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the capillaries in his eyes, the practiced warmth that had probably charmed 1,000 donors and board members now shifting into something else, something that recognized a threat. "What I want," he said quietly, "is for you to focus on patient care and stop creating problems where none exist. Inventory systems are complex. Deliveries take time. Equipment gets reassigned between units. You're new here. You don't understand how hospitals actually operate." But his hand had moved to his phone. She saw it. The small micro-expression that flickered across his face as his fingers brushed the screen. The calculation. The decision made in an instant. Elena had seen that same expression on insurgents in Marjah when they realized they'd been outmaneuvered, the moment when panic masqueraded as authority, when cornered predators decided to strike. She set the printouts on his desk. "I just thought you should know," she said. She turned and walked out before he could respond. The night shift continued. Elena moved through the cardiac unit with the same competence she'd brought to every shift for 3 years, checking vitals, documenting charting with obsessive precision, helping residents who still asked her questions and offering observations they'd eventually learn to take seriously. Room 302 had a post-MI patient stabilizing beautifully. Room 305 needed a dressing change. And room 304, where Captain James Rourke lay in pharmaceutical sleep, his traumatic brain injury healing neurons by neuron, his forearm bearing her name in black ink, a memorial to a rescue he no longer remembered. At 1:24 a.m., the unit was at that peculiar stillness that only happens in the deep hours, when the night is more night than any other time, when the world beyond the hospital doors has gone to sleep and the machines do their work in dimness broken only by monitor lights casting green shadows on walls. Elena was charting at the central station when the alarm began. Not gradual. Not a slow escalation. The code blue alarm screamed like something being murdered, sharp and electrical and impossible to ignore. Room 304. She moved before thought crystallized. Muscle memory, the kind that lives in tendons and firing patterns, the kind that comes from 4 miles of running through crossfire with a green beret's weight across her shoulders. She was at the bedside in 7 seconds, already assessing as she moved. Captain Rourke's eyes were open, confused, his chest heaving against the oxygenated air that wasn't helping. His skin had gone the color of old concrete. His jugular veins distended like rope cords beneath his jaw. His hypotensive, the on-call resident, Dr. Chen, said from the foot of the bed. His voice shook. His hand shook worse. Really hypotensive. 70/40 and dropping. Muffled heart sounds. I think he's got. He reached for the phone to call the attending surgeon, his fingers already moving toward the buttons that would summon the hierarchy, the authority, the person who could make decisions. Elena was already pulling on sterile gloves. The sound they made snapping over her wrists was like the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. Pericardiocentesis, she said. Not a suggestion. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that had directed corpsmen through mortar fire, that had issued orders in situations where hesitation meant death. Now. He has maybe 3 minutes. We need to wait for the attending, Dr. Chen stammered. That's an advanced procedure. We can't just. But Rourke's blood pressure was dropping. 68/36. His oxygen saturation falling despite maximum flow. The cardiac tamponade was compressing his heart, squeezing it like a fist, and every second they hesitated was a second closer to cardiogenic shock. Elena had seen this twice in field hospitals in Helmand Province, once in a convoy ambush outside Marjah when shrapnel had punctured a Marine's pericardial sac. She'd performed the procedure under fire, her hands steady as surgical lasers, with mortars screaming overhead. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the hierarchy to descend from whatever upper floor it inhabited. She prepped the subxiphoid area with antiseptic, and the smell of it, sharp, chemical, assertive, filled the small space around the bed. She positioned the 14-gauge angiocath needle at precisely 60 degrees to the horizontal, advanced it slowly with steady pressure, feeling for the give of tissue, for the moment when resistance dissolved and entry began. 45 seconds. Her breathing was even. Her hand could have been carved from stone. The needle breached the pericardium. Straw-colored fluid, serosanguineous, brilliant under the lights, filled the syringe as she aspirated. The room seemed to expand. Rourke's chest heaved once, twice, and suddenly he was breathing easier, his lungs finally able to inflate fully, his heart finally able to beat without armor around it. "Get me a liter of normal saline," Elena said to the nurse who'd appeared in the doorway. "Run it wide open. He's going to need volume while we get cardiothoracic in here." The attending surgeon arrived at 2:09 a.m., pale and moving fast. He took one look at the procedure tray, at the aspirate in the syringe, at Rourke's vitals, now 94/58 and climbing, and his face went white. Rourke's oxygen saturation was back to 96%. The code was over before it had truly begun. The cardiac monitor showed a sinus rhythm, steady and strong, the rhythm of a man who'd lived through something that was supposed to have killed him. The surgeon stood in the doorway, processing. His eyes moved from the equipment to Elena's hands, still gloved, still calm, already discarding the needle with the deliberate movements of someone who'd done this 100 times. He was trying to calculate backward from the result, trying to understand how a night nurse with no advanced credentials had just performed a procedure that was supposed to require physician supervision. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. Elena turned to look at him. Just for a moment. Just long enough to measure the question, to understand what he was asking underneath the words. She'd spent 3 years becoming invisible, becoming just a nurse, becoming someone without history or capacity or the weight of rank. She'd earned that obscurity. She'd paid for it with nightmares and isolation and the sound of her own name echoing in empty apartments. "I read a lot," she said. But in the hallway, his phone already to his ear, Dr. Sterling was calling board members at 2:31 a.m. She could hear his voice from room 304, the tone shifting from fury to something more calculated. More strategic. He was already reframing the narrative, already weaponizing the one thing she'd tried to protect, her competence. An unauthorized procedure. A nurse exceeding her scope of practice. An incident report being drafted even as she was documenting the intervention that had saved Captain Rourke's life for the second time, though he would never know it was her hands holding him alive both times. By 5:53 a.m., Sterling had filed the report. By 6:15 a.m., security was waiting at the time clock with a cardboard box, their faces professional and apologetic as they escorted her through the lobby. The morning shift was beginning. The day nurses were arriving, their fresh scrubs and composed faces a contrast to Elena's overnight pallor. They watched as the security guard, a woman named Patricia who'd always been kind about holding the elevator, carried the box to her car. Her combat boots were the only item they'd let her take. The worn leather, scuffed from running through Marjah dust, still carried the memory of that night for years ago when she'd carried Captain James Rourke for miles under fire, when she'd torn her boots crossing creek beds and rocky terrain, when she'd refused to put him down. The dust from that night had never fully come clean. It was still there in the creases, still there in the memory leather held. She sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot with those boots in her lap and understood, with the clarity that only comes when everything is stripped away, that she was utterly alone. No rank. No recognition. No future in the hospital that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. Just a woman with a pair of worn boots and a secret that had finally, inevitably, become her only enemy. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have. Elena carried it down the 6th floor corridor of Sacred Heart at 6:06 a.m., the fluorescent strips casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made people look like ghosts. Security had been polite about it. That was the worst part, the politeness. A man named Derek with kind eyes and a name tag had handed her the box himself, filled with her locker contents, a change of scrubs, her personal trauma shears with the military-grade titanium blades, 3 protein bars she'd stashed during night shifts, and at the bottom, the combat boots. The one she'd been wearing in Marjah. Still caked with dust from a city 7,000 miles away. She didn't look back as the elevator doors closed. Dr. Sterling, meanwhile, was already 3 phone calls into his damage control protocol. His office at Sacred Heart still smelled like the espresso machine he'd installed last year, a $6,000 Italian thing that nobody else was permitted to use. At 6:15 a.m., before the morning shift briefing, before Janet Kim could file any incident report about his demand for footage deletion, he'd called Gerald Hutchins, a hospital board member and fellow member of the Cherry Creek Country Club. Hutchins owed Sterling a favor, a significant one, involving a lawsuit that Sterling had personally recommended his brother-in-law to defend back in 2019. A suit that had saved Hutchins $300,000 in damages. Gerald. Sterling. Need a small thing, he'd said, his voice carrying that particular tone of ease that comes from knowing the person on the other end will say yes before you finish the sentence. What do you need? Hutchins had asked immediately. Personnel file on one of my nurses. Elena Martinez. Recent termination. I need to make sure the board understands the severity of her performance issues. The instability. She's claiming harassment now, I'm sure you'll see it coming. I'm just being thorough. He'd let silence breathe. It would be helpful if that narrative, the instability, the mental health concerns, was already documented somewhere official before she tries to spin this. Hutchins understood immediately. That's what made him useful. By 7 a.m., Sterling had called two of Elena's references, both physicians she'd worked with during her first year in Denver. He didn't ask directly. He never did. He mentioned concerns. Expressed worry. Painted a picture of a nurse who'd been questioned by hospital investigators regarding scope of practice violations and who'd been acting increasingly erratic following a patient emergency. One reference, Dr. Patricia Mullins from Denver Presbyterian, had actually heard rumors about the cardiac tamponade case. Sterling had guided her interpretation effortlessly. I'm sure she's dealing with something personal, he'd said. But we can't have that kind of instability in critical care. Not with patient safety at stake. By the time Elena had walked out of the hospital with her cardboard box, the narrative was already written. Unstable. Mentally compromised. A liability. The kind of nurse you had to let go, quickly and quietly, before she became a legal problem. 3 days later, Elena sat in a folding chair in the waiting room of the Denver VA hospital, 23 miles from Sacred Heart, surrounded by the specific gravity of broken people. The intake form in her lap was printed on the kind of paper that absorbed sweat. Question 17 asked about suicidal ideation. She'd marked yes. Her hand hadn't trembled when she did it. The waiting room smelled like coffee that had been sitting out for hours and the particular antiseptic and hopelessness odor that clung to every VA facility in America. To her left, a Marine with a prosthetic left leg below the knee stared at a daytime television show without watching it. To her right, an Army specialist in a field jacket rocked slowly, both hands pressed over his ears as if he could squeeze out whatever sound was haunting him. Elena recognized him. Sergeant Derek Mills. She'd treated him during her deployment rotation in 2019, taught him how to apply a tourniquet to his own leg when shrapnel had shredded his femoral artery. He was 19 then. He looked 40 now. He didn't recognize her. That was the other thing that hurt. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her mother in El Paso. Rosa Martinez had been calling every 8 to 12 hours for 3 days, each call increasingly frantic. Elena hadn't answered any of them. Her mother didn't know which city Elena lived in. Her mother thought Elena was happy. Her mother thought Elena had moved on from the Navy, that the nightmares had stopped, that the daughter she'd raised in Juarez and El Paso had become someone stable and whole. The intake form asked about family contact. Elena left it blank. The waiting room clock ticked audibly. 2:48 p.m. Someone called a name, not Elena's. An older woman with a cane stood and shuffled toward a doorway marked Intake Services. Elena shifted in her chair. The waiting was worse than the admission. The waiting meant thinking. The thinking meant remembering. She'd made it 8 months without anyone knowing where she was. 8 months of being nobody. 8 months of the quiet working, the anonymity protecting her like a shield. Now the shield had rusted through. Sacred Heart had discarded her like contaminated waste, and the VA was the only place left that would take her. She was still holding that thought when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Is this Elena Martinez? I need to talk to you about my father. Captain James Rourke. Call me back immediately. Sarah Rourke, USMC. Elena stared at the message for 30 seconds. She didn't call back. She deleted it. She set the phone face down on her lap and watched the specialist 2 chairs over continue rocking. The intake form lay half completed in her other hand. She picked up the pen to finish question 18. That same moment, Lieutenant Sarah Rourke was standing in the lobby of Sacred Heart Hospital, 3 miles away, asking for the nurse who'd saved her father's life. Her marine dress uniform drew looks, the kind of looks that meant respect and unease in equal measure. She carried a small manila folder containing her father's medical records and the worn leather boots he'd kept in a drawer for 7 years, waiting for someone he couldn't remember to come claim them. "I need to find the night nurse who was working the cardiac unit Tuesday night," Sarah said to the head nurse, a woman named Janet Kim whose name tag identified her with 15 years of employment. "The one who performed the emergency procedure on Captain Rourke. Cardiac tamponade. I need to thank her personally." Janet checked the records. She shouldn't have checked so quickly. She should have been suspicious of a military officer in dress blues asking for specific personnel. But Sarah had the right dates, the right patient name, the right understanding of what had happened. Janet pulled the schedule. "Elena Martinez," Janet said. "But she was terminated yesterday morning. I don't have current contact information." Sarah's expression shifted. Her jaw tightened in a way that made Janet understand, without being told, that she'd just said something important. Sarah stepped away and made a phone call. One call. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Then she said, "Someone will be there within 2 hours. And you'll find that nurse." At 12:36 p.m., the hospital's main phone line received a call from Naval Special Warfare Command, Joint Base San Diego Coronado. A Navy commander, rank 005, requested Elena Martinez's complete personnel file, her last known address, and any contact information maintained by the hospital. It was not phrased as a request. The voice on the other end made it clear that the hospital would comply, that this was official, and that there were no alternatives to cooperation. Dr. Sterling heard about it from the administrative assistant who took the call. He was standing in the hallway outside his office, and his face went the color of old concrete. Not pale. Something harder than pale. Something like stone. He called Marcus Chen from IT before his hands had stopped shaking. Marcus was a Marine Corps veteran, 8 years of service, 2 tours in Fallujah. He'd been in IT at Sacred Heart for 3 years because he liked the quiet work and the healthcare mission. He sat in a climate-controlled room in the basement, managing the hospital's security camera system. "Marcus, I need you to delete security footage from the past month. Cardiac unit, cafeteria, emergency room Bay 3. All of it. Now." Marcus didn't ask why. He looked at the deletion request on his screen, looked at the urgent tone Sterling had used, and understood immediately what had happened. He'd reviewed the footage himself 2 days ago, all of it. The cafeteria incident. The throne chart. The gentle, methodical humiliation of a nurse who'd never once responded with anger. The way she'd just kept working. He thought about Elena Martinez, who'd held the doors open for him every time they crossed paths, who'd called him Marcus instead of "IT guy," or "Can you fix my computer," who'd once brought him coffee from the good place in downtown Denver when she'd overheard him saying he'd forgotten his travel mug. Completed, he typed into the message to Sterling, and then saved every frame of the past month onto an encrypted drive that fit in his shirt pocket. By 1 p.m., the sound started. A sound that cleared the parking lot of civilians like a blade through butter. Rotor wash. Loud. Serious. Military. 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended towards Sacred Heart's rooftop helipad in formation, their blades cutting the Colorado air with the particular authority of Department of Defense aircraft. The cardiac unit staff froze mid-task. The ER team stopped moving. The cafeteria went quiet because it always does when a military helicopter lands on a civilian hospital's roof. That sound carries memory and weight. The doors burst open at the entrance to the emergency department. Marines in desert camouflage, hands near their weapons, took positions that weren't aggressive but weren't casual either. A Navy commander in dress white strode through the automatic doors, his uniform so precisely fitted it looked like an accusation against disorder. Behind him, a Navy SEAL team leader. Behind them, an FBI liaison in a dark suit who moved like he'd been in federal law enforcement long enough to know exactly how much authority he carried. The commander's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. She's not on this property currently, but I need her location and I need it now." Janet Kim's hands trembled as she opened the personnel file. The other nurses crowded around her like children seeking permission to breathe. The head cardiologist, Dr. Reeves, backed away from the gathering, his face already moving through the mathematics of career damage assessment. She's a senior chief. Navy, Janet whispered. 3 Bronze Stars. There's a file about, she couldn't finish. Lieutenant Sarah Rourke stepped forward in her Marine dress uniform, and her voice carried the particular clarity of someone who'd been trained to be heard in chaos. My father, Captain James Rourke, spent 7 years trying to find the woman with the call sign Valkyrie. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez carried him for miles under sustained enemy fire in Marjah, Afghanistan. She's the reason he's alive. The attending surgeon who'd questioned Elena's scope of practice turned white and walked directly into the medication room. The SEAL team leader stepped forward and began reading from an official Navy citation, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. Senior Chief Martinez provided emergency trauma care that resulted in the survival of 3 wounded soldiers while under active Taliban engagement. An FBI liaison in dark sunglasses announced, Senior Chief Martinez has been conducting classified teaching on emergency combat medicine for forward surgical teams. Her protocols have resulted in estimated 200 additional lives saved in theater. She is not a liability. She is a national asset. The commander's voice dropped lower, somehow more terrifying. Where is she? Janet Kim could barely speak. We terminated her 3 days ago. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. In that silence, you could hear the elevator humming, the 4-pump beeping in Trauma Bay 2, the breath that the head cardiologist had been holding since he heard the words Navy Cross. The SEAL team leader's expression went flat in a way that suggested vast amounts of experience with disappointment and the capacity to survive it. You fired a Navy Cross recipient. Sarah Rourke held up the worn combat boots, still caked with Marjah dust. The sight of them, actual physical evidence of survival, of rescue, of a woman in those exact boots pulling a bleeding man across insurgent-held terrain, seemed to hit everyone in the atrium simultaneously. Before Dr. Sterling could move, before he could calculate his next escape route, Marcus Chen from IT walked directly toward the FBI liaison, holding an encrypted drive the size of a lighter. Everything, Marcus said. Every instance of harassment. Every frame of the billing fraud. Every minute of the past 14 months. It's all here. The waiting room door at Sacred Heart swung open at 2:24 p.m., and the woman who walked through carried the specific weight of someone who had already buried soldiers. Marine Lieutenant Sarah Rourke moved like her father, shoulders back, jaw set, eyes that had seen things civilians weren't equipped to understand. She approached the information desk with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without repetition. I need to find the nurse who saved my father's life. Twice. Once in Afghanistan. Once here. The receptionist's fingers froze above the keyboard. Sarah didn't wait for a response. She was already moving toward the cardiac unit, her dress uniform drawing eyes the way lightning draws attention before the thunder arrives. The administrator intercepted her at the elevators. Lieutenant, we can't just... With respect, you absolutely can. My father is Captain James Rourke, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He was admitted here with traumatic brain injury. A Navy nurse performed an emergency pericardiocentesis 5 days ago and saved his life for the 2nd time. I'm here to thank her. Now, where is she? Within the hour, the sound everyone would later describe as identical to thunder without the waiting, the percussion of Black Hawk rotors turning the air into pressure, into authority. 2 helicopters, one landing on Sacred Heart's roof, another holding position above the parking lot. A military convoy sealed the hospital entrances. Uniformed personnel who moved with the fluid precision of people trained to operate in spaces where hesitation meant death began a systematic sweep through the building. A Navy commander, his chest a map of deployments and decisions, walked through the lobby doors with the kind of presence that made the fluorescent light seem to dim in comparison. His uniform bore the insignia of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He moved directly to the information desk, and his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to answers, not obstacles. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. Where is she? The receptionist's face went pale. I don't. She was fired 3 days ago. She's not. I know when she was fired. Where is she? The packed atrium had gone silent. Visitors froze mid-stride. Nurses stopped mid-conversation. Sarah Rourke stood in the center of the marble floor, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the open space with the clarity of someone trained to command attention in combat conditions. My father told me to find the woman with the call sign Valkyrie. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. She carried him for miles through Taliban crossfire in Marjah. She pulled him from the rubble when the compound took in direct fire. My entire life exists because of her. And 3 days ago, she did it again. The head nurse emerged from the cardiac unit with Elena's personnel file trembling in her hands. She whispered the words like prayers, 3 bronze stars. A Navy Cross. Citation for Valor at Marjah. Decorated for exceptional service in emergency medicine. She never said anything. She just came in. She just worked nights. The attending physician who had been present during the pericardiocentesis felt his back flatten against the wall as a SEAL team leader stepped forward, Command Master Chief David Graves, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, beard like iron wool, eyes like still water. He began to recite, his voice steady and ceremonial. Senior Chief Martinez performed an emergency pericardiocentesis under combat conditions on September 14, 2009, in Marjah, Helmand Province, preventing exsanguination of a squad leader with penetrating thoracic trauma. Citation for Navy Cross. Approved by the Secretary of the Navy. Recommended for further advancement. Dr. Sterling emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. His face went grey the moment he saw the uniforms. His hands, which had thrown charts and orchestrated humiliation, began to shake. And then an FBI liaison, credentials already displayed, stepped toward Sterling directly. Her name was Special Agent Rebecca Thomas, and she had spent 3 days reviewing hospital records. Her voice was clinical, final, the sound of judgment already rendered. Dr. Marcus Sterling, you are under federal investigation for healthcare fraud totaling $340,000. Equipment billing for supplies never delivered. Kickbacks from Medtronic and Cardinal Health traced through shell companies. Additionally, we are reviewing evidence of interference with a decorated service member's civilian employment, which falls under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. That's a federal statute, Doctor. Federal charges. Federal prison. The door at the back of the atrium opened. Marcus Chen, hospital IT specialist, former Marine Corps corporal, walked toward the gathered crowd carrying a laptop. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way people sound when they are delivering truth that has already been decided. I preserved every frame of security footage from the past 4 months. The cafeteria incident on September 2nd. The chart thrown at her feet on September 8th. Every conversation Dr. Sterling had in the back office with billing coordinators. I didn't report it at first because I wasn't sure. But when I saw the military arrive, I understood. I cross-referenced the timestamps with billing records. Dr. Sterling submitted phantom charges on days when equipment he claimed to order wasn't even available from suppliers. The trail is clean. The evidence is complete. The administrator's face had gone from concern to catastrophic. The board members who had taken Sterling's call suddenly had urgent reasons to avoid eye contact with federal agents. Within 48 hours, the Colorado Medical Board would suspend Sterling's medical license pending review. The FBI would seize his financial records. His attorney would file emergency motions that would be denied. His wife would freeze their joint accounts. The news outlets would arrive at his lake house asking about the fraud investigation while his neighbors photographed him carrying boxes from his car. But that moment, the moment when the SEAL team leader approached Dr. Sterling, badge already displayed, when the commander asked for Sterling's office keys, when the reality of consequence finally touched him, that was when the cafeteria went silent in an entirely different way. Not the silence of intimidation. The silence of reckoning. Elena was brought to the hospital by the Navy commander himself. She was at the VA, still holding an intake form with shaking hands, when he found her in the waiting room. His uniform was immaculate. His presence was gravity. He didn't ask permission when he placed her dress blues on the chair beside her. The navy fabric, pressed and perfect, carried the weight of everything she had surrendered. "Senior Chief, you're needed." Elena shook her head. The words came out measured, precise, the voice of someone who had already grieved what she was losing. "I'm not Senior Chief anymore." I walked away. "I can't, the noise, the President disagrees." He let that sentence sit in the fluorescent-lit air between them like a decision already made. "You have 7 days to report to the Rose Garden. Full honors ceremony. Your medals, your rank, your service record. It's being declassified right now." Sarah Rourke sat down on Elena's other side. She placed the combat boots between them, the ones still caked with Marjah dust, the ones Elena had worn when she pulled a dying green beret from rubble and carried him for miles through crossfire. Sarah's voice was soft, but it carried the same authority as her father's. "My father remembers now. The neurologist said seeing your name on the news triggered recall. His entire memory of Marjah came back in about 6 hours. He's asking for you. He wants to thank you. He wants you to know that he knows." At Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling cleaned out his office under security escort. His hands moved with the jerky precision of someone whose world had just become significantly smaller. The $50 bill he had pinned to the bulletin board, the one he'd bet on Elena quitting within a week, was still there. A departing nurse photographed it. Another screenshot it for the group chat. By evening, it was circulating through every hospital in Denver with the caption, "He bet $50 on her breaking." She brought the Navy to the hospital. The administrator approached Elena where she sat in the waiting room of the VA, still processing the impossible mathematics of her life suddenly becoming visible. His posture was apologetic. His tone was calculated to prevent lawsuits. "We would like to offer you full reinstatement. Back pay. A formal apology from the hospital administration and the board. We understand if you want to pursue legal action, but we would prefer to." Elena looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Her voice, when it came, was like a door closing on something that would never open again. "I have other duties now." 7 days after the Black Hawks landed on Sacred Heart's roof, Elena Martinez stood in the Rose Garden of the White House in her dress blues. The fabric hung perfect against her frame. The medals were aligned above her heart like constellation markers, 3 bronze stars, each one a specific decision made under fire, each one a life saved or protected, and then the Navy Cross, the highest honor a service member could receive, the medal given only for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in the face of enemy fire. The President's hand rested on her shoulder as he recited her citation to the assembled press and military leadership. The words rang across the Rose Garden with the weight of official recognition, of truth finally spoken aloud. On September 14, 2009, in Marjah, Helmand Province, Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez performed emergency medical intervention on a critically wounded squad leader under direct fire, then evacuated him for miles through hostile territory while maintaining operational security. Her actions prevented loss of life, preserved tactical advantage, and demonstrated exceptional valor. Captain James Rourke stood beside her in his green beret dress uniform. His eyes were clear now. The neurologist's intervention had worked, seeing her name had triggered something in the damaged architecture of his brain, and the memories had returned like a flooding river. He stood at rigid attention, the way trained soldiers do when witnessing something sacred. Sarah Rourke held the combat boots between her hands like they were a holy relic. The dust from Marjah was still visible on the leather. It had never been cleaned. It had been preserved exactly as Elena left it. When the President finished speaking, James Rourke saluted her. Slow. Deliberate. The first salute he had given since his injury, muscle memory overcoming brain damage, gratitude overcoming trauma. He held the salute for 7 full seconds, and Elena returned it with the precision of someone for whom the gesture held the weight of brotherhood and survival. Later, in the reception that followed, Rourke showed her the tattoo on his forearm, the one Elena already knew was there, her own name, inked in memorial, preserved across 4 miles of fire and 9 years of separation. "I knew I owed you my life," he said quietly. "Now I know why." Elena's hands touched the ink, and for the first time since Marjah, tears fell freely. Not hidden. Not ashamed. But witnessed and honored. "You gave me mine back," she whispered. The Martinez Emergency Medicine Fellowship was established that day, funding combat medic training at 17 VA hospitals across the country. Elena accepted the position as director, her PTSD finally channeled into purpose rather than hidden in the fluorescent-lit corridors of a hospital where no one knew her name. In Denver, Dr. Sterling began his court-mandated community service teaching CPR at Denver Community College for minimum wage, his former colleagues walking past without acknowledgement, his entire career compressed into a basement classroom and the knowledge that every person he trained to save a life was someone his fraud might have killed. Marcus Chen was promoted to Sacred Heart's Chief Information Security Officer. His first act was installing a system to flag billing irregularities, protecting future nurses, ensuring future discoveries. Janet Kim framed the photograph of Elena in dress blues and hung it in the cardiac unit nurses' station with a plaque reading, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." If you've watched this far, you understand that the people who change the world are often the ones we overlook. Subscribe to see more stories of quiet heroism finally recognized. Like this video if Elena's story moved you. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Let's celebrate the heroes among us.